That's a straight line by everybody.
Welcome, everyone, to the Eugene City Council work session for July 28th.
I don't believe that'll help.
Just wanted to let you know that I had two requests to be in, put motions forward. Claire called me first, so Councilor Charette has the first motion. Councilor Clark also asked, so he has the second. And are we having an introduction first to the...
We aren't,
Okay,
Mayor.
good. Then we'll just go to work. Okay, so as everybody probably knows, this is work session is about the sick leave ordinance. Councilor Charette.
Thank you. So we'll just get right to it. I move to adopt Council Bill 5127, an ordinance concerning sick leave dated July 28, 2014.
Second.
Moved and seconded.
So thank you. So since the ordinance in front of us has some changes in it from what was published, I was going to ask Glenn to walk us through some of the substantive changes that were made, and some of these were proposed by other councilors, and my understanding is proposed in response to what we heard at public hearing and in other venues.
If you have your July 28th version, which is the one that I emailed out, it's actually at your places too. I'll just walk through that and just talk about some of the major changes that were made. Bottom of the first page, section 4.572, there's an applicability section that now makes explicit what had been implicit, which is that this would apply to employers engaged in business inside the city, but only to the extent that our employees are working in or scheduled to work inside the city. So to the extent that there's a Eugene employer that has an employee who's working in Springfield or Junction City or New York, the time that employee spends working outside the city, they would not be earning paid sick leave for that. Subsection 2 of that section contains the exemption for governments. All governments would be exempted. And then paragraph D at the top of page 2 of that is the exemption for employees in the building and construction industry whose terms and conditions of employment are covered by a collective bargaining agreement. Section 4.574 adds definitions. The prior version of the ordinance was going to leave those definitions to the administrative rules in response to requests to add more detail to the ordinance. We added definitions here. Most of those are substantially similar to Portland's definitions, which is where I copied them from. Section 4.576, sub 1, again makes clear that the only hours that somebody gets to earn paid sick leave over are those performed inside the city. Let's see. Page 3 on use of sick leave, subsection 1, there are two requirements for use of sick leave. The first is that the employee must have been employed by the employer for 90 days. And if the employer is based inside Eugene, then that's the requirement. If the employer is based outside of Eugene, then in addition to having been an employee for 90 days, the employee also must have performed work inside Eugene for that employer, totaling at least 240 hours in a year. Subsection 2 of 4.578 identifies some of the circumstances under which sick leave could be used. The prior version of the ordinance was going to leave that to administrative rules, and again, in response to comments, we added that detail here. Subsection 3 makes clear that in order to use sick leave, it can only be used during times that the employee is scheduled to perform work inside the city. So if you have an employer outside the city, employee has earned sick time, unless that employee is scheduled to work inside Eugene, that employee would not be able to use sick leave. Subsection 4 adds a provision on shift trading, which is, again, very similar to Portland's. On page 4, the administrative rules provision, we removed some of the provisions in there since some of those questions are now being decided in the ordinance themselves. So the administrative rules will be more like the city's typical administrative rules, which just provide greater detail to what's in the ordinance itself. At the top of page 5, we added something so that it would be more difficult to file a private cause of action. And by more difficult, what I mean is before somebody can go to court, they would first have to file a complaint with whether it's the city or BOLI, have enforcement proceed through the city or BOLI, and then if there are any additional requirements in the administrative rules, they would have to comply with those, and only after all of that would they be able to file a private cause of action. At the bottom of page 5, we added the requirement that the city manager provide the council with biweekly updates on the development of the administrative rules, as well as a draft of the proposed rules for comment before adoption. And then on the last page, section 4 is a new section that contains the severability clause.
Great, thanks, Glenn. I think the only other thing that I'd point out is that we included, expressly included paid time off as that meets the threshold of this ordinance would be considered in compliance, both in usage and in accrual. So in the couple minutes I've left, I just want to kind of remind us how we got to this point. There's a lot of work that's been done to bring us to tonight. Many voices and opinions have been heard. We've heard from thousands of residents who support the idea of workers in Eugene being able to access earned paid time off to deal with an illness or a child's illness or other medical need. We've heard from businesses who support this ordinance and those that don't. Councilors have been open to hearing from all points of view, and a number of the amendments offered today are meant to address some of the concerns without weakening the benefits this ordinance will bring to working families who are the reason for this effort. The ordinance this council is considering tonight will establish a modest standard of 40 hours of paid time off, protection from being fired or demoted due to illness, and provide working people who don't have them now with some basic workplace and economic protection. On balance, the estimated cost to the average business of less than 1% of payroll, about 0.9% of payroll on average, not 2 or 3% of gross profits, as some have said, is worth the benefit to our community as a whole that we will realize by providing the least among us with some increased financial stability. And when we know that when hourly wage workers have more income, they spend it in the local economy, thereby multiplying the economic benefit to local business. Working people of our community are told that if they put in the hours and work hard for their employer, they can be part of the American dream. But the reality is that in too many cases, these hardworking people get the short end of the stick and find themselves faced with difficult choices and few options. Stay homesick or leave work to get a sick child from school and risk being fired, or losing a day's pay they need to feed that child. So as much as some opponents want to pretend that this does not happen in Eugene, the reality is for many working people in our community that it does, and we heard from them at our public hearing. So I'm proud to be part of this effort to improve working conditions for people living and working in Eugene.
Alan, you're the seconder.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I'm honored to co-sponsor and co-author this with Councilor Surratt, and I agree with all the points that she made. This is a family-friendly and worker-friendly ordinance that will enhance our community's health, increase our productivity, and it's very doable and very affordable. It's doable and affordable because the costs are modest and the admin burden is modest. While opponents have over-exaggerated the impacts and the costs, the truth is that none of those worst fears have become reality in a single community that has implemented a similar policy, not a single one. What we've been trying to do here over the last 6 months is really try to balance the needs of employers and employees. Not an easy task. So we reached out to the community and to hear what they had to say. We had received over 3,000 comments, emails. There were op-eds. Multiple people testified. This is the most talked about issue in my nearly 8 years on the council and debated issue. So we've listened and listened and listened, and we heard what people had to say. And the one thing that was real clear to us was that folks said there wasn't enough clarity in the ordinance. So we added an exclusion for governments, including Lane County, which they knew before they passed their irrelevant anti-family, anti-worker votes the other day. And we also clarified this only applies to workers inside Eugene, work performed inside the Eugene and not outside Eugene. We clarified that doing only a minor amount of work in Eugene, less than 240 hours a year, means that ordinance doesn't apply to those folks. Clarified that paid sick leave can be used for. We exempted building trades that Councilor Evans put forth under collective bargaining agreements. We clarified that if you already provide PTO or paid sick leave, you're in compliance and need not do much more than what you're already doing. And we allowed for voluntary shift trading and required that you go to BOLI before you can file a lawsuit. And we clarified that doesn't apply to temporary or probationary employees working 90 days or less. So while these are all the details, we shouldn't forget why this is here and why it's in front of us and what this is really about. It's about the 25,000 workers in Eugene that don't have paid sick leave. It's about the high school kid who came and testified and said he had to stay home and miss high school to take care of his little sister because his parents had no paid sick leave. And about the mom that had to choose between getting fired and staying home with her sick child. These are the people that are one sick child away from being fired. And it's about the person that said losing even 1 day of pay, 20% of their week's wages, means the difference between being able to provide their family with groceries, rent, and maybe needed medicine. So this is a family-friendly, worker-friendly ordinance that will enhance our community's health, increase our productivity, and it's very doable and very affordable. And I encourage my fellow councilors to support it.
Mike, you're up next, followed by George and Chris.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I wonder what the rush is. We have this on our agenda for this evening. Glenn, do we run into any difficulty with the fact that this is prescribed for specific review this evening?
No. The council, under public meetings law, the council has the option to take up an issue when it chooses.
Okay. Well, I suppose I'll say I've spoken to a lot of the reasons why I think this is a poor public policy choice. And it's really disappointing to me to listen to my colleagues describe the motivations and the words and processes of others and our partners at the county, calling their work specific names like anti-worker. That's small, and it doesn't behoove a discussion of this kind. And it's unfortunate because all of us, I agree entirely with some of the things that Claire said at the beginning there, that it's a decent and honorable and intelligent thing to do to help people that need it in an appropriate way. But when some of us think that this will hurt those same people more than it will help them, that's a decent discussion that honorable people can disagree about and shouldn't have to be subject to being called names for their differences of opinion. And so I'm a little bit sad that we've done that. As a matter of fact, I recognize, because I can count, that this will pass. And in an effort to try and work through, okay, I understand that on principle I disagree with this, but that it will likely pass, A. And B, that I've seen enough polling information to lead me to believe, too, that a majority of people in our community probably would like to see this pass as well. So I developed an idea that, okay, well, then the question isn't really, even though I can agree that I've lost that fight. And the question then isn't whether we do this, but how we best do this to minimize the impacts to our community that I believe and many other intelligent people believe will hurt the very people you're trying to help. So I brought forward this motion here that I was prepared to vote for, in favor of, to recommend that the legislature have our full endorsement to pass this for something statewide. Now, that was to begin a conversation about the wisest way to put this in place, but it's now been preempted, so it's meaningless to do. That conversation was, is it wiser for us to put this into place knowing that the state legislature will in fact pass this and preempt all our work in the process? And in then doing so, we've done nothing but start a fight with Lane County that we can't afford and that is frankly kind of petulant and unwise. I'm running out of time here, so please put me down for a second round.
George.
Thank you. I feel the same way Mike does about this, and I, too, am at a loss to what the big rush is, other than it was predestined from day one anyway. We have heard from many of our jurisdictional partners, as well as the chambers of many of the different cities throughout Lane County, about how they how they feel they were left out of any conversation and how it's going to affect them. And I, from the very beginning, said, you know, I would be more supportive of this if this was a statewide measure, so they were on equal playing ground. And the response that I got was, well, you know, Portland does it, San Francisco does it, but we're not Portland, we're not San Francisco, we're not that big. We have to depend upon our neighboring communities for our livelihoods, as well as they depend upon us. And I just think that, you know, the approach that we're taking is totally unfair to some of the other jurisdictions, because they were not allowed to be part of the conversation until after the proposed measure or ordinance came out on the 28th of June. That does not leave people time to really delve into the finer details. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put out an amendment in order to limit the ordinance to only those businesses that are located inside the city. I move to amend Section 4.572 sub 1 to replace the words engaged in business with the word located. B, Section 4.578 sub 1 by deleting paragraph B. And finally, C, Section 4.582 by deleting subsection 6.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Discussion. I have in the queue for a second round, Alan, Mike, and George, but this is who wants to speak to this particular thing. So I've got Mike, and then I have George. And then Alan.
All right. One of the things that George's amendment brings up has been an interesting question to mine when we talk about home rule authority and we talk about municipal purpose. That was one of the questions I asked the attorney. Were you able to find out some good guideposts for us with regard to the idea of municipal purpose?
There are no black and white definitions of municipal purpose for purposes of city home rule powers. What the courts will do is to defer to, in this case, the city council, the political body, as to what's a municipal purpose, because it's really a political question. And so if the city council says this is a municipal purpose under the city charter, then the court would defer to that. What the courts have said in terms of the extent of a jurisdiction, a city's home rule powers, and it's a case involving the city of Eugene back in 2001, the AT&T versus city of Eugene case, the court has said that a home rule city basically can do anything it wants so long as A, it is authorized by the grant of power in the city charter, and B, is not preempted by state or federal law. The city of Eugene's charter, like most city charters, has a general grant of power that says you have the power to do anything and everything that you possibly can do under the Oregon Constitution. So the charter clearly authorizes this. So then the next question is whether state or federal law preempts.
Sir, I was just asking you about the issues around the idea of municipal purpose. And the reason I interrupted is because I don't know that I'm not an attorney, certainly, but I don't know if I agree with you that it applies to this. The reason for my question is to say, okay, if it doesn't put sideboards on the scope of our power, certainly it puts sideboards, as does the charter, on the geography of our power. Does it not?
If your question is whether, to use a different hypothetical, the city of Eugene has the authority to prescribe in the city of Wallowa what color curtains are in a house, the answer would be no.
As long as we're within the boundaries, as the charter talks about, of our city, we have the authority to act to whatever extent we believe is municipal purpose, correct?
Depending on what you mean by the beginning of the sentence as to whether you're acting based on what's happening inside the city.
That's the key question here, because my question is what it is exactly that we're regulating with this particular ordinance. And let me ask a more specific question. If we were to say, Anybody who works in the city of Eugene has to wear glasses while they work inside the city limits, has to wear sunglasses. That would be us regulating the act of that work taking place inside the city. But I'm wondering what it is exactly that we're regulating with this particular ordinance, because it seems to me, and perhaps I'm wrong, but it seems to me that we're regulating the agreement for the sale and purchase of labor, which may not always take place within the boundaries of Eugene for those companies located elsewhere. Can you enlighten me on that a little?
I would describe what this ordinance does differently. I would describe it as the council setting the conditions under which a company can do business in the city of Eugene. And so what this says is, if you choose to do business in the city of Eugene, whether you're a business located in the city or you're a business located outside the city, once you decide to do business in Eugene, for what you are doing in Eugene, we're going to impose certain requirements.
May
And
I
the
interrupt
ordinance
just for a moment there and say, who's choosing at that point? What if the employer makes no choice about where the employee decides to work, but the employee decides to work in Eugene? Has the employer obligated themselves at that time?
I'm not sure I understand that, because in every situation where I've worked, the employer gets to tell the employee where the employee is going to work.
What I mean specifically is to say, as a hypothetical, that you're a salesperson and you have a broad territory that's Western Oregon, and the boss says, I would like you to make sales calls throughout your territory, and where you go and where you spend most of your time is up to you. So if, to the degree that that employee chooses, for example, hypothetically, to spend all their time in Eugene, is that employer obligated when they really made no choice as to that employee's geography?
I would disagree with your premise that the employer made no choice. The employer gave the employee the ability to work where the employee wants to. The employer could say, as you're making those sales calls, in light of the ordinance that the Eugene Council just passed, I don't want you working inside the city of Eugene.
Would that exempt the employer at that point?
If the employer does not have any employees working inside the city of Eugene, then the ordinance would not.
What I mean is, if the employer expressly forbids the employee from working in Eugene and the employee decided to do so anyway, would that obligate the employer?
If the employee works inside the city of Eugene 240 hours, then yes, the employer would have to pay.
Interesting. I would tend to vote in favor of George's amendment. I don't know that it will probably pass, but I will anyway, because I don't believe we have the authority to act extra-municipally and extraterritorially. I believe that authority is clearly not ours.
George?
Thank you, Mayor. Well, we clearly have the authority to do so, as proven by the ordinances in famous cities of Portland, San Francisco, D.C., and Seattle. So I will not support this amendment. It weakens the intent. And I'm really happy with the amended ordinance that has been crafted, which I will totally support, and I won't support any amendments to it at all. We've crafted a really nice document here. My understanding is the legislature will take this up starting next February. There is absolutely no guarantee that they will actually pass anything statewide. And if they do, actually, I think if majority agrees with the ordinance as it has been amended, and I certainly hope that we do, we will provide we will have done most of the heavy lifting for the legislature. We will have a really nice product here, and they won't have to put too much work in it at all to apply it statewide. So I will not support this motion to amend. Thank you.
So there's two more on this motion, Alan and then Chris.
Yeah, we actually regulate businesses outside the city all the time. Perfectly within our authority to do that, and we do it on a regular basis with the city of Eugene. Example is building codes and numerous other codes. A construction company that is located outside the city of Eugene, when their workers come into the city of Eugene, they abide by our codes, not the codes of the home city that they're from. They abide by the city of Eugene rules. Anytime you do anything in the city of Eugene as a business, you abide by the rules that the city of Eugene put forward. That's what home rule is all about. the workers that work in Eugene have to abide by the rules that set. So it's perfectly within our rights to do that. And the 240-hour rule that we put into the ordinance actually also limits this so that there aren't the occasional worker that drives in to buy something and drives out, or flies in for a day and flies out. Those people aren't covered. So there's a minimum level that you have to reach before you get covered. So we're not talking about trivial things. And the change that Councilor Poling is putting forth, where it says replace the words engaged in business with the word located in the city. To me, that means headquartered, and that would eliminate a whole slew of businesses that are not located in the city of Eugene. All Walmarts, all Safeways, all grocery stores, any national brand name might potentially be located outside the city, and their employees could be determined to be employees of that branch and not in this branch. So I think the way that we've crafted this is actually that if you're engaged in business and your workers perform work in the city of Eugene, then it applies to you. It doesn't matter if you're Walmart from Arkansas or Starbucks from Seattle. If your workers are in Eugene, working in Eugene, it applies.
Glenn?
I just wanted to clarify the motion because George asked me to craft it, and what he read is what I gave him. The way, in my opinion, this would apply is actually it would include any business that is located in the city. It doesn't have to be headquartered. So a McDonald's that is located in the city, a Walmart that's located in the city, as long as there's a physical location for that business, then it would have to comply under this amendment. The parts of that business that are located elsewhere would not. So a McDonald's or a Walmart in Springfield under this amendment would not, but people who are working at the Walmart and McDonald's in Eugene would have to. It's not limited to just corporate headquarters.
So how's that different than what we're proposing in the revised version?
The revised version, what this would do is say you have to have a physical presence, a physical building in Eugene. So if you are, and I don't think there's such a company, Springfield Roofing, and you don't have a physical address in Eugene, but your workers come in to do it, under this amendment, the Springfield business would not be covered.
So if that Springfield Roofing were to do 90% of their work in Eugene, and their workers had continually done that for years, it wouldn't apply to them, just for the mere fact that their business location is someplace else. So we'd actually also be incentivizing people to move their businesses then, I would suspect. That's a rhetorical question.
I figured that out at the end.
Okay, Chris.
Thank you. We're really getting down to the nub of the discussion. I mean, this is really, where for me the kind of meat and potatoes is. I was in Florence over the weekend, and I was in a social situation with a group of people who live in Florence, and they were talking about what's happening in Eugene, what's going on, and I was happening to talk about this, and I mentioned that we were talking about a sick leave ordinance that would ensure that people who were sick or not able to come into work for a legitimate reason wouldn't be fired from that job. And the person sitting across from me said, well, it's not a benefit you should provide, or why shouldn't you do that? And I was really surprised that somebody in Florence would say, yeah, why shouldn't people be able to do that? And I said, well, but part of the debate is that this would apply to businesses that are located outside the city, but a worker may come in. And his response to that was, well, you can't tell businesses outside the city what to do. And I think in a nutshell, he kind of captured what has been the quandary for me is, I think it is legitimate and worthwhile and reasonable to provide this benefit to workers in Eugene. The issue then boils down to what constitutes a worker in Eugene. And I think we're going around and how does the worker relate to the workplace, or the employee relate to the employer? And that is really what's really troubling for us. And I think the way to simplify it, what George is proposing is the simplest solution, is to say, just take it from the employer standpoint. If the employer is in Eugene, it applies to other employees in Eugene. If the employer is not in Eugene, it doesn't apply to any of the employees, regardless of whether they come into Eugene or not. And I understand the 240-hour rule is a good way to try to say, well, let's not make this apply to just casual people who just happen to kind of pass through on their way somewhere. So the 240 hours is really a step in the right direction, but I think there would need to be something more tangible if we were going to try to wrestle with the issue. I will support George's motion, because I do think it is an effort to try to clarify that. But if it fails, then I will have alternative language, which I think will get us even closer to what I would hope to be able to achieve, which is to acknowledge workers outside or employers outside the city who have a worker inside Eugene, and any reasonable person would say, yeah, that person's working in Eugene. The boss may be sitting in some other city, but that worker's working in Eugene. They're here consistently, they're here regularly, they're here for a large amount of time. A reasonable person would argue that that's a Eugene worker. And if this fails, then I might try that language to see how that would work. But I will vote for this, not with the expectation that it will pass, but with the acknowledgement that that is probably for me the thorniest issue in this whole discussion.
Great.
Thanks, Mayor. Glenn, I got this may be a little bit of minutia around this, but are we talking about people who have physical presence within Eugene, like, for instance, someone has a building or has rented space, or are we talking also about people who may have a post office box address that says Eugene? Would that be applicable for the intent of the law? So in other words, we've got people all the time who just have a P.O. box here. They may have people working here, and then they turn around and say, okay, well, we're really getting out of Eugene. We're just go across the river or across the freeway and get a Springfield address.
When I drafted this amendment, I can tell you what I had in mind, and it would really be up to the maker of the amendment to tell you what he has in mind. But what I had in mind was the former. It was a building. It wasn't a post office box. It was you are actually, your business is located here, as opposed to you drive in from Junction City, Springfield, wherever, pick up your mail and go back. So it would be the former.
The former, okay.
Clear.
So, I recognize that this piece of the city looking like it's trying to dictate to businesses located outside of our city limits has been very contentious in terms of this discussion. The reason that I can't support this amendment or any other amendment that's going to exclude those businesses is the very pertinent example of home health care workers who may be employed by a business located in Veneta, Junction City, or Springfield, but does a majority of their business caring for vulnerable and elderly folks in the city of Eugene. They are delivering services in the city of Eugene. They're working in the city of Eugene. And if we are trying to pass an ordinance that improves public health, helps prevent the spread of disease, and protects workers, in my mind, this kind of exemption is just a non-starter. So I will not support this amendment or any other proposed amendments that try to exclude businesses because they happen to be headquartered or do not have a physical location within the city.
Okay, I think we're ready to, yes.
I guess I would say that there are questions, legal minds disagree, and there are questions about which of the three county ordinances may have more legal weight than the others. The second one applies to this question. And should this amendment fail, that one will certainly be litigated. And it's my belief we will absolutely lose that. So my question is to the city attorney, in such a case, what occurs if is there a severability clause to any of this ordinance that we're passing? So should one part of it be found by courts that we lack the authority to do this piece, for example, would that doom all of it?
You have two questions in there.
Yes.
The answer is there is a severability clause now in the ordinance itself. There is also a severability provision in the city code, which is so you don't have to have it in the ordinance.
Right.
And the answer to the question of if the court struck down this aspect, the applying to businesses that do business in the city but are physically located outside the city. If the court struck that down, then the severability clause would preserve or save the rest of the ordinance.
Okay. I must say, I find this, as well as one or two other parts, the most troubling, because we're willing to stick our, it seems that those who would not be interested in making this concession are interested in sticking their thumb in the eye of our partners that have strong, and I mean our other government partners that represent other people, have strong disagreement about this. And one of the reasons I heard was because none of the other people who are being regulated in this particular case, businesses and people who don't live in Eugene, have the ability to vote for any of us, and are thus left without the opportunity for recourse if they disagree with us. And so I'm kind of sad not to see more support for seeing the common sense reasonableness of this amendment.
I want to be respectful of this as an issue that good people can have different perspectives on. I also want to say if we don't want us to characterize other people, we shouldn't be characterizing ourselves. And and I also want to say that at the heart of this for me is I could see that there are people, many people who would spend up to 90% of their work hours in Eugene who are from businesses that are outside Eugene, and the whole purpose of this particular ordinance is a health ordinance. It's for the health and well-being of our community. It's to have people be able to stay home when they're sick. And so we would be defeating the whole purpose of this if we didn't try to apply it in an even-handed way to people who work in our city. Ready to vote? All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3. All those in opposition, please indicate. Oops.
You thought you'd have to break it.
I did. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Goes down. Okay. So next in the queue, the main queue, we have Chris and then George Brown.
Thank you. What I'll do is I'll move straight to my third motion, since it's related to the one that we just talked about. Since that is not going to pass muster in terms of the discussion about what's in and what's not in, what I would like to do is to be even more clear about what we're trying to get at in terms of a worker who is inside Eugene, regardless of where their employer might be. And we've already moved down that road in terms of creating one definition for what is a worker inside Eugene, and that's the 240 hours. So we've already begun to try to define what constitutes the degree of working in Eugene that would cause somebody to be underneath this ordinance or fall under this ordinance. And that's 240 hours, which is a pretty significant amount of time. And the intent is to try to keep just the casual, I was passing through town and got swept up out of the way, and people who know that their workers are only going to be casually in town. But I would like to even be more clear and more specific so that people who employers outside the city of Eugene who may be wondering about, well, does it apply to me or does it not, or is it 240 hours and I got to keep track even whatever, it may help to clarify it to say, and this gets at Claire's point about, let's say, a home health care worker. That home health care worker is in Eugene every day for several hours at the same location helping that person. A reasonable person would say, yeah, that person's working in Eugene. That home health care company may be in Springfield, but hey, they're in Eugene. They're a Eugene employee. They're employed here. So I'm proposing a motion that would also provide, in addition to the hour definition, would also talk about workers who are regularly engaged in business at consistent and specific locations inside the city. So it adds just some additional clarification that we may not be trying to catch every single casual worker who happens to step foot in the city, but people who any reasonable person would say, yeah, they're employers outside town, but they're working here. Anybody can see that they're working here. Whether it's 90% of the time or more than 240 hours, it's a consistent, regular location. So I move to amend Section 4.572 Sub 1 to read, the provisions of Sections 4.570 through 4.584 of this code apply to employers physically located inside the city and to employers of any other paid workers who are regularly engaged in business at consistent and specific locations inside the city, but only to the extent that workers are working or scheduled to work inside this city. And B, to add to the administrative rule provisions by amending Section 4.582 sub 6 to read, providing a methodology for establishing when a worker is regularly engaged in business at a consistent and specific location inside the city, and B, when a worker whose employer is located outside the city is considered to be working at a regular and consistent location inside the city. If I have a second, I'll speak to you. Okay, thank you. This is an effort to say we're not going to say that anybody who has an employer outside the city could not legitimately be considered a worker in Eugene. But I'm trying to say, let's be clear that we're not trying to cast a broad net and sweep everybody up who happens to come into town. I know 240 hours helps to get there, and that's a very good thing. But I would also like to have an additional element to it that says, hey, if you're at a place in Eugene consistently and regularly, then you got to be considered a worker in Eugene. That also helps to reinforce the notion of the Target and the Walmart employees, because that reinforces that notion that they're consistently and regularly in Eugene, so there would be no ambiguity about that. So hopefully this can help to be kind of a middle ground between what is currently in the revised ordinance and George's amendment, which would have excluded everybody.
So Glenn, sorry,
Yes.
tell me the difference, what difference this makes to what we already have in the proposed ordinance.
Let me give you an example. On the one hand, you have the home health care worker who is coming generally to the same addresses every day or every other day, however often they appear. So they're coming to particular places consistently. So that's one example. They would be covered. What under this would not be covered, but what currently under the main motion is covered, is my example of Springfield Roofing Company, which comes into the city, employee comes in, and maybe the employee spends half their time in Eugene, but it's always at a different address. So they're never at a specific, consistent location. So that would be the difference. This would limit the people who are coming into the city to those that show up at generally the same addresses, and the detail would be identified in the administrative rule as to exactly how that would work. But that's the main difference.
George Brown and then Claire.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, you're either working in Eugene or you're not. I can't support this amendment. It muddies the waters. It will exclude too many people, and for no good reason. The idea is to cover everyone that's working in Eugene. Think of other trades. There's landscapers, there's plumbers, there's electricians, there's the roofers. They're moving all around. They're Eugene, like a lock and safe company. They're coming in and they're helping people with their security at their businesses. They're spending hours in Eugene. Under the ordinance that we're going to be voting on, they will be accruing paid sick time leave if their employer's not already offering it. This amendment would say, well, sorry, we have to go to the same place every day. Otherwise, we're not going to cover you. It makes no sense. It's going to exclude a lot of workers, and the main intent of the ordinance that we're considering is to be inclusive, not exclusive, and saying, well, we're willing to cover certain kinds of workers but not others. No. The intent of the ordinance is to cover everybody who's not currently covered, to allow them to be able to earn. They have to earn it. I mean, does it matter whether you're working at a healthcare facility and you go there every day, or whether you're, helping people on a remodel on their house and you're going to different houses all the time? No, it makes absolutely no difference. It's a false distinction that, in my view, that it doesn't clarify anything and really will exclude a lot of people unnecessarily. So I will definitely not support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate Councilor Polling looking for some compromise.
Pryor.
Oh, excuse me. My apologies.
If they still both start with P.
Councilor Pryor. But I actually agree with what George said. He articulated it very well. And I think the other challenge with this particular language is it actually would cause a lot of confusion for employers. And one of the things that I was looking for in some of the changes that we made to the draft ordinance was to clarify things as much as we're able at this point in the process. So this, I think, proposal from Councilor Pryor would leave a lot of employers and employees wondering whether or not they fall under the ordinance, whereas the 240-hour threshold is very clear and easy to calculate, and only really has to be calculated once for any employee that's staying on with the business.
Thank you, Mayor. I won't support this amendment. It doesn't go far enough, as George's did, to help clarify the difference in between in and out of the city, although I disagree with it for different reasons than George does. But I wonder, I think Chris is trying to get at something with this that I think is important as the rest of this conversation goes on, and its legislative intent. For me, one of the other big problems with this is that there is so much ambiguity and so much that needs to be filled in with administrative rule after the fact, that although we have the most able city manager I think we've had, it still is a very tall order, and certainly, many years from now when he decides to retire comfortably, why, we may have a different city manager who may want to change it and alter it in some way, because it's all done in administrative rule, or a good portion of it. So my question is for city attorney, do I understand appropriately then that legislative intent and how a court looks at that is derived both from our conversations at the table here and from our communications about this and some of the things we prescribed? For example, in the purpose statement here, it talks about this being a solution for general issues around public health. And as the mayor has just done, she just mentioned that the purpose of this, or the great majority of this, is being done to safeguard public health. Is that sufficient legislative intent that a court would look at this proceeding and say, that's why they were trying to do that, they were acting in their authority to try and assure public health?
It depends on what question the court is actually being asked. So if it's a question as to the interpretation of the ordinance and how does legislative intent fit with that, the first thing the court does is it actually looks at the words of the provision to determine whether there's any ambiguity in those particular provisions. If there is ambiguity in those provisions, then the court would look at the purpose statement, see how that helps resolve it. The court would look at any legislative history that was relevant, and so that would include the conversation that the council had. It could include a motion to amend that passed, because that shows, oh, well, the council specifically dealt with this issue and here's how it dealt with it. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to that question. It really depends on the precise question that the court is being asked to address. But the first place the court is going to look is not to this conversation, it's not to the purpose section, which, like in land use, you have purpose sections, and you got, sort of, well, here's our aspirational goals. The first place the court is going to look is the actual language of the provision that's being applied, and it's only if that provision is ambiguous that the court then says, okay, we need some help in trying to interpret this provision, what's out there. And then the goal of the court is to implement the council, in this case it would be the council's intent with that provision. But your intent might be this direction. The words of the ordinance might be very clear that it's this direction. In that case, the court isn't going to look at the transcript of this proceeding. The court says the words of the ordinance are clear.
So, for example, this has no particular section where one needs to prove that one is sick to their employer. So that's one of the issues for me, is that it's really about time off and on what basis someone may use it, because they don't actually have to prove they were sick. They don't have to have a note from their doctor. They don't have to prove that point. They just have to say that's what they were doing. Am I correct in how this reads?
The ordinance doesn't speak to that, other than to say that as part of the administrative rulemaking process, the administrative rules can include provisions to deal with those kinds of issues, to make sure that a business can assure that there isn't any fraud on the part of an employee.
Right.
As well as making sure that the business is not retaliating against
Right.
an employee.
So based on this conversation, my next question is for the manager. Do you take it as part of your charge from the part of this ordinance that gives you the authority to write that that's the purpose of this, is that it's specifically to be used for sick time and the purpose is to guard public health in the process?
So while the manager is thinking about his answer, let me add, because, again, there's language in the ordinance that says it's a little broader than just being sick. There's a specific provision that says it can be used for domestic violence, sexual assault, and so not sick in the sense of a medical illness. So there are other reasons why you get to take sick leave under this than just because you have a cold.
Certainly. But the broad purpose being to guard general public health, I would think.
Right, I think that's what people have talked about around this table.
You understand that to be legislative intent?
Yes, but I think partly what Glenn is talking about, what we will do is write administrative orders that deals with the specific provisions of the ordinance, primarily given the broad intent that council has talked about.
Broad intent? Okay, thank you.
So I think Chris wants to say something now.
Yeah, in the interest of time and counting noses, I will withdraw my amendment, if it's okay with the second.
Sure.
Okay.
So that will then, thank you.
And then I have other, whenever you're ready.
Oh, you want to put, you want to do another motion? Is that what you want to do? Okay.
I would move to amend the definition of sick leave in section 4.574 sub 6 to read as follows. Sick leave, time off that has been accrued and may be used by an employee under the sections 4.570 through 4.584 of this code. For employers with 6 or more employees, sick leave shall be paid time off. For employers with 5 or fewer employees, sick leave may be paid or unpaid at the discretion of the employer. I'll speak to it if there's a second.
I'll second.
Moved and seconded.
This is consistent with what Portland has, and we talked about using Portland as the model, and this is what Portland's model is. And I think part of the reason why Portland adopted it and why I would support it is that it acknowledges the fact that a small employer has a different burden than a large employer, and that sometimes it's extremely difficult to be able to provide paid sick leave when there's just you and one other person working in the business. I know the desire would be to be inclusive and have everybody, but I don't want to be inclusive at the expense of a small business operation. Having been a small business owner, some of you here are small business owners, there can be a significantly different situation for somebody who only has 1 or 2 employees. And while the benefit is still protected, the ability to not be fired for being sick and the ability to take sick leave is protected for employers of all size. Whether or not it is paid sick leave, I think, is more wisely left to the discretion when it's an employer of 5 or fewer. And as I say, this parallels what Portland's doing, so it's not out of touch with what our other largest city in the state has done.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, I can't support this one either. This is why our ordinance is better than Portland's, because we include everybody. It's inclusive.
Except the people.
There are people who, in the Portland government, who, voted for their ordinance, and one of the regrets they have is that they put that 5-person limit on it. They wish now they had not, and hopefully they will amend theirs in the future. No, we can't put a limit like that. The idea is to include everybody, and I most certainly will not support this. Thank you.
I was thinking about this one really hard, especially since I had seen it in the Portland ordinance, and I had a call from Portland saying it's just been a very troubling and difficult thing to be in their ordinance, and they would definitely recommend not doing it. And I also heard from people who represent home health care workers basically saying that it would make it so that some of those that really care about being covered would not be covered. So for that reason, I couldn't support this. Anybody else? Great.
Mayor, I agree with that, except for I've spoken, and I think most of us around the table have spoken with a number of very small businesses who are family-owned, closely held, who have their own internal arrangements of how they handle sick leave and how they handle paid time off. While I'm not comfortable with the language in this particular amendment, I think at some point as we work this out, we will be coming back to it, that we specifically look at how we can work with categories of businesses that may not be in the home health care field, but say maybe in another different field that, or several different fields that this might be more applicable for, small emerging businesses that, don't necessarily have the ability to, manage time off in this particular manner. So I would like for us to look at that somewhere down the line. I don't have language in terms of that. Tonight, I will, support not this motion, but the motion as it stands. But I think that we do need to have some point where we are looking at some specificity around certain businesses, closely held businesses that don't necessarily have the wherewithal to manage or keep track of some of this, or find another way for them to keep track of it.
Mike, and then Betty.
Thank you, Mayor. George just mentioned that one of the reasons he likes this is it doesn't exclude anybody, except that the new version does exclude people. It excludes those covered in the construction trades and collective bargaining agreements. And so my question is, why just the one industry sector? And it's really more, I suppose, to the city attorney. Would we face a legal issue, a legal problem, a legal challenge if we tried to apply this to those for whom collective bargaining agreements are in place?
I don't know whether we'll face a legal challenge. If we are challenged, I believe that the court will uphold the ordinance. Even though...
Article 1, Section 21 notwithstanding?
Correct. Article 1, Section 21, which is the impairment of contracts clause provision, the cases under that, and I know that was one of your questions. The cases under Article 1, Section 21, including the one that you specifically referenced, are cases where the state is a party to the contract and then the legislature decides to change legislatively the terms of that contract. And what the court has said several times is the legislature cannot change, and at least in many circumstances, cannot change the terms of a contract that it is a party to, or unilaterally change the terms of that contract.
But it can impair other people's contracts at will?
I don't know that I would say they can impair at will. On the other hand, the legislature changes the terms of contracts implicitly whenever it changes the minimum wage, whenever it creates new provisions for employers. There are existing provisions out there, and then the legislature goes about changing those, and it does it without having been successfully challenged that it violates the contract
And it's
clause.
your opinion that our authorities, we have sufficient authority to act contrary to that, the spirit of 121 as well, that we can perhaps get in the way of existing labor agreements in our community?
It's my opinion that the council could adopt this provision, and it would we would be successful in defending this provision if somebody sued us saying, wait a minute, this provision changes the terms of a collective bargaining agreement. The other thing I would point out, as long as we're talking about collective bargaining agreements, is that many of those collective bargaining agreements are going to contain provisions on sick leave or paid time off that are going to provide a benefit that is substantially equal or better than the provisions in this ordinance. For those businesses that have those collective bargaining agreements, there are sections both under the accrual of leave and the use of leave that would say as long as you have a benefit that is
In
equal.
place.
Right. So what we're really talking about are those that
Right.
are less.
So I wonder why, under the circumstances that our authority is sufficient to do it, and we're doing it for everyone else, why we're exempting one particular industry segment under the thought process of collective bargaining agreements. That doesn't seem fair or equitable to me. Thank you.
Betty?
Thank you. I don't think we can assume that everyone who gets sick time is going to take it. And I think in a small business where there are 5 or 6 employees, they're even less likely to say they're sick when they're not, because everyone's going to know everyone very well. But if in the case of someone who did not want to have paid sick time and had 6 employees, they might decide they can't afford to have 6 and only have 5 or 3. So it might end up with some people losing their jobs. And that's as likely as it is that people will take sick time when they don't need it. Thank you.
Greg?
Yeah, I differ with Councilor Clark on this. I think that when we have created exemptions for other government entities, we're looking at LTD, eWeb, other similar ones, and we're also looking at unique situations. In this case, we're talking about building trades, construction, which the nature of the work is definitely different than someone coming to, say, work at Fred Meyer 8 hours a day or some other entity, whatever time, part-time, whatever it be. I think that what we've done is we've tried to craft this in a way that makes sense for the building trades and the construction industry, and not only is it would be easier to use for the employee, but also for the employer. And I think that that's what we're trying to get to. And I think that from what I understand, both employers in these areas and employees are in agreement around this.
Just to clarify that a little bit more, the building and construction trade is unique in that the people don't work for a particular building, they work for the union hall, and the employer pays the union hall for those benefits that they accrue and not from the employer. So it's so unique that it deserves an exemption.
Okay, I think we're ready to vote on this motion. All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2. In opposition?
I'll vote in favor, Mayor.
Pardon?
I'll vote in favor.
3 in favor. Now in opposition? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It fails. Now we're back.
Well, I had a third motion I was going to put out, but considering my luck at the table tonight, I don't think I will do that. What I will say, though, is that I wanted to make sure I took time to express my appreciation for all the work that went into this revised version. I'm very pleased with how much better this revised version is than the original draft that we have. It has really gone a long way towards providing additional clarification, specificity, and clarity around exactly what the ordinance does and doesn't do. For that, I'm very appreciative, and there was a lot of work that went into getting to this point, and I'm very pleased with that. This is a benefit that I would dearly love to vote for. I really would. I think it's an important benefit to provide. I would love to vote for it, and I think that the amendments that have been put together, or the revised version that's put together, is as close as we could come to something that I would gratefully vote for. And when it does pass, not if, when it does pass, I will be pleased to see this benefit being provided. Regretfully, I won't be able to vote for it, not because I don't believe in the benefit, but because I still have concerns over the issue of transient workers and dictating conditions to businesses outside Eugene, which is my only real reservation around this. I think the work that's been done here is great. I want to thank the staff and my fellow colleagues on the council who worked very hard to try to get it to where it is. And so I just wanted to be clear that when I have to vote no on it, it won't be because I don't believe in the benefit. I will be glad to see that put in place. It's just I couldn't get past that one element, and but I do want to thank you for all the work that you did.
So I have 4 people left in the queue, for George Brown, Alan, Mike, and George Polling.
I'll pass.
Okay. Alan?
Yeah, I wanted to add two comments. One to my previous comments, which was that because this is in part an ordinance that is protecting public health, home care workers, restaurant workers, grocery store workers that handle food and things like that, it needs to apply to everybody, not just some of the workers in Eugene. And this is a map that was off slate.com. It's a map of the world, and it's a map that shows all the countries in the world that provide paid sick leave. And you can note, and they're all in green. If you'll notice, the United States is not in green. The United States is the only industrialized country in the world that does not provide this benefit to its workers. It's one of only 18 countries in the entire world that don't provide this to their workers. And that puts us in company with North Korea, Somalia, Syria, Bhutan, and a select few other countries that don't provide this to our workers. So this, to me, is very telling about where the world is and how the rest of and that the United States is a little behind on this particular issue. So I think this is very telling, an important fact in our deliberations here.
Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. All kind of hyperbole aside, I agree with Alan and his points that in the sense that a wise company would offer this. I agree that it's a good thing. I agree that it's wise to try and protect especially the folks who are most vulnerable in our workforce. I agree that despite my principled objection to the manner in which this was presented and debated and put forward, I also recognize that not only are there the votes to pass it, but I recognize that a likely majority of our community is in favor of the idea. So what's left to us, I believe, if we're really wise and we're here to represent the people of our community, is, even if I disagree, our job is to find the best way to implement this, or the best way to bring it about with the least number of consequences to those same people and to the community, and specifically to the city organization. And I believe we're going about it exactly the wrong way. I had a motion prepared in order to recommend that we call on the legislature to pass this, that we urgently request it, that we all, unanimously say we think it's a good idea. And the reason is because doing paid sick leave this way at the city level guarantees one thing. We've just started a legal fight with the county. It's going to happen anyway. The legislature is going to pass it. They're going to preempt what we've done, and we will have started a legal war with the county that we did not have to start. We will have created a public expense we did not have to create. We have burned bridges with other municipalities and with other partners that we did not have to do. I feel a little bit like I'm sitting in the back seat with Thelma and Louise behind the wheel, and we're headed for the cliff. And it's, although I have principled differences with the way we're doing this, I can still see the wisdom of asking the legislature not to let us be at a competitive disadvantage with our community, our partner and our neighbor next door and other nearby communities. So we're hamstringing ourselves, we're hurting our own tax base, and we're starting fights that are going to be very expensive for the community to make a point, and it's not a very good one at that. So I'll vote against the ordinance because I believe that not only are all the things I just said true, but we lack the authority to do it in the first place. And I urge my colleagues to give that great consideration before they vote to do this.
George Bowling?
Yeah, again, I just want to reiterate that from the very onset on this, I was in favor of moving this to a statewide level to put everybody on the same playing field. I feel by passing this, we're putting our city at a large disadvantage. And you can say, well, other cities do it, but again, I'm going to refer back to the size of our community compared to some of these other communities that have passed this, one of which has no information back on it yet because it hasn't been in existence long enough. But the other thing is, I don't believe that it's the charge of the city council to be dictating human resource issues in the private sector. Again, that's something that should be done at a state or a federal level and not on a municipal level. You know, yes, we can pass ordinances that pertain to land use laws, zones, public safety, you know, but that, for us to get involved in the private industry in dictating human resource issues, I believe is not our charge. And I think that had we taken Mike's approach, I think it would have been a better outcome overall for everybody within the entire state. And that's what we're trying to do, is get everybody on the same page with some sort of a paid sick leave or paid time off.
Claire?
So I just want to appreciate the robust discussion and the respectful exchange of differing opinions. I'm very pleased to hear that my fellow councilors support the idea of a statewide measure. I think that's an excellent idea. Conversation about state action is still of value. And by passing our own local ordinance, we're actually helping inform that conversation, as Councilor Brown mentioned earlier, at the state level. But this has not been rushed. We have been considering this for half a year, and for many workers, further delay until a time when the state may or may not take up and pass a similar measure. It's not fair to them. I want to remind us that our sick leave proposal here to be passed by the City of Eugene has been endorsed by the local chapter of the NAACP, the Oregon Council on Civil Rights, the Oregon Public Health Association, ASME Local 1724, representing City of Eugene workers, SEIU, UFCW, the Oregon AFL-CIO, the City of Eugene Human Rights Commission unanimously, and Church Women United. So we are certainly in good company in terms of passing this ordinance here in our city for our workers in our city.
Mike?
I am so sure that the legislature is going to pass something, and I believe that that will preempt all of the work that we've done. However, we're going to see the effects of that as time goes on. We're also going to put ourselves in a difficult place, and so as a result, I move to amend this to add a final section that we review as a council this ordinance and the administrative, the body of administrative rules that will implement it no later than June 15th of 2015, so that we can have a final review of what the city manager puts in place as how to implement, and so that we will know by then what the legislature truly has or is imminently likely to do.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, George.
Thank you, Mayor. I won't support this. We're going to be given regular updates on the manager's progress toward developing the administrative rules. Most of the main points, the most important points, with this amended version are in the ordinance. And in my view, there will be no reason for a review before the ordinance takes effect in July of next year. I can't support this. Thank you.
I just want to point out to councilors in Section 6, there is a review. City Council shall review the sick leave program adopted by this ordinance after 2 years of implementation in July 2017. I'll also point out that this doesn't go into effect until July 1, 2015. So the 2015 legislature will hopefully be over by then, and without ours actually having gone into effect. I'm not so clear that, given the track record, that this will pass at the state legislature. If as it matriculates through that process, I think our ordinance will actually be, hopefully be the model from which they work, and adopt that at a state level. So I believe in bottom-up democracy where states actually, where cities and counties and other things build up to action at the state level. We've seen that many times. So I think it's a good model, and I'm encouraged that we'll probably pass this evening.
Great.
Yeah, I was going to echo what Alan said, because that was my amendment, was to, look for a 2-year review, 24 months, and at the appropriate time in 2017, June of 2017, that we would look at that and go back and review the ordinance after we've had some time to see what the issues are, what's good about it, what's not working, and there doesn't preempt us from being able to fix things as things go along prior to 2017.
I just wanted to make one comment, and then we'll vote on the motion. I don't think that we have burned any bridges. In fact, I think we've been trying to build bridges for a lot of people to have paid sick days, paid sick leave. I don't think we're fighting anyone. And I know for a fact that in all the conversations that have been going on with commissioners, with other people, I have always stated I will not say anything negative about anyone in this, and my intention is to work with people, all our partners, whenever possible, because that's what we're expected to do by the public. So my intention is, and I could go down a huge litany of things that we have done together over this last few years to better our metropolitan area in many ways, and we'll continue to do that because it matters to us that everyone's successful. So I think we're ready, and just remind you that someone else is, another city's voting on this very thing tonight, San Diego. Great.
Mayor, I would encourage Councilor Clark to bring forth his resolution to the legislature as a sign that the city is interested in a statewide measure on this. And I think that, just seeing from the heads around the table, I think that we could possibly get full agreement around that. And I think that it would make perfect sense for us to do that and to be able to encourage the legislature, because as someone just said, Alan said, this is not something that is going to be necessarily a slam dunk at the legislature. We don't know what the legislature is going to do in 2015, but we can, if Councilor Clark feels this strongly, is make a resolution that we do send to the legislature prior to their convening in 2015.
If Councilor Clark would like to do that, he can do that after our vote.
May I speak to this particular amendment again?
All right, because we have a motion on the table right now.
Right.
Councilor Clark.
Yes, I'd like to respond, I suppose, to my friend here by saying, as I mentioned at the outset, I brought that forward as an alternative way for us to work, where we might work more cooperatively together. And to say that our intention isn't to offend our neighbors is an interesting statement, considering if I were to swing my arms about wildly and hit my friend George here in the nose, I could say it was my intention not to hurt him, but it sure would probably hurt. We have damaged relationships with our neighbors by our insistence that we act, just as we did during House Bill 3337, the point of which was that our actions didn't give sufficient understanding and sensitivity to our effect on our neighbors and our partners, and we're doing it again. And I brought that forward as a different way for us to consider moving tonight that would achieve the result that both the community and that the majority at the table wanted, and to do so without starting fights. But it is too late. We have started the fight, and I don't have a need to go further.
All right, then. Motion's on the table. All those in favor, please indicate. Yes.
This is mine.
This is the amendment.
Amended motion.
No, it's the amendment.
Mine to bring
Can you
it back
repeat
for
it?
review.
But when?
This is on Councilor
Before
Clark's
June 15th.
amendment
Right,
motion.
You want to report back.
Review before June
Oh,
15th.
sorry, I got jumped ahead. All right, Mike's amendment. All those in favor, please indicate. 2 in opposition. 6, it fails. So now we're back to the main motion. All those in favor of the main motion, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in opposition. 1, 2, 3, it passes. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mayor.